Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcasts, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. I immediately regret doing that. Hello, my name is Kyle Naranya, and welcome to the show. This is episode 107, and on this week's episode, there's been a slight change, but not really. I will be reviewing and discussing Terminator Zero, the Netflix series that is finally something original from that franchise. As it is a television series review, it will be full of spoilers. So if you have not had a chance yet to watch the show, no worries. You can, I guess, listen to Question of the Week and the outro. But I'm hoping people have had a chance to watch this. It did come out on Judgment Day, August 29th, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing how much I enjoyed this show, so let's not waste any more time and get into Terminator Zero. Ba-bum, bum, ba-bum.
Listen to me carefully. They're here. They've sent this thing to stop me. That means my research is right. My plan will work. I can win this. We can save everybody, but they are going to try to use the children against me.
Terminator Zero comes from Mattson Tomlin, who received uncredited rewrites on The Batman, but will be credited as co-screenwriter on the upcoming The Batman Part 2. Taking place in Tokyo in 1997, leading up to Judgment Day, one of my favorite elements of this show's release is they released it on Judgment Day, August 29th, 2024, of course, it coming out this year. There's a lot I loved about this show. For one, I'm so happy, finally, a complaint similar to Star Wars, where we are finally able to let go of the Connor family. This takes place in Tokyo, a vastly different setting than California, which was the 5. Have we had 5? 6? We've had 3 Terminator 3s and 2 regular ones, so I guess 5 films at this point. This being the second television series for the Terminator franchise in general, the prior being, of course, the Sarah Connor Chronicles. This being very different, and the aesthetic not being anime made in North America. The whole show is an anime production, which allows for obviously a Japanese cast as well as an American one. I watched the American voice cast or the English dub. I don't even know if it's a dub. I'm not sure. I did look into this a little, but I didn't find out this piece of information, whether this was developed with English. So I guess every version is a dub. Is that how that would quantify? I don't know. This actually kind of hurts my brain. I loved this show. As I mentioned already, it has nothing to do with the Connors. It is about somebody. Okay, we're in full spoilers, so it's kind of hard to talk about everything, but I said we're in spoilers, so I'm just going to talk about everything. Malcolm Lee, being a scientist who was born in the future, comes back to the, well, what was the present? Terminator's so confusing, but one of the best parts about the show is how it addresses all of the different time travel from the entire franchise, finally addressing how this works. And I have to say, somebody who's really loved a lot of time travel projects, this goes with a different strategy, or at least a way of explaining how all of these continuities can fit together in a way that I really did enjoy, which is, I probably shouldn't skip around it because it is relevant to this, which is, as opposed to just being the streamlined Back to the Future, you go back, this kind of does Back to the Future 2 to some degree, which is you are going back, which results in a new future. So you are constantly creating, or you're visiting a past. It is confusing. Oh my goodness. You are entering a past that is not the one from now. So the zigzag metaphor where you are creating a new past, which obviously creates a new future. So there's no loop. You cannot fix the present you are living in. I found to be really interesting, particularly because, for one, having always been obsessed with John Connor and his death, and then obviously Sarah Connor in 2 original films, this kind of explains why certain things always are going to happen. Judgment Day, from a Doctor Who standpoint, feels like a fixed point in time. It's going to happen, and it's not necessarily its prevention that's going to save the human race. It might be how, at least the way that it's presented in this show, how we react or counteract Judgment Day with Skynet. Malcolm Lee being somebody from the future developing AI, And the Terminator franchise has never felt more relevant now. I wouldn't say the fears of AI becoming like this are in our near future, knock on wood, but AI is, as artificial intelligence in general, is becoming more and more affecting our everyday lives, particularly in the creative space with the Writers Guild of America, the Screen Actors Guild of America, and the Video Game Actors of America, who are currently on strike because of studios wanting to use it to reduce costs. And personally, AI shouldn't have anything to do with art, but that's neither here nor there. 1997, however, because Malcolm Lee is from the future where the show takes place in Tokyo, the setting and the relationships to what's going on with the Terminator are automatically different. It's something that was addressed when creating the show, which is when you put the Terminator in the United States of America, which is where we've seen him for the 5 live action films, access to firearms are substantially easier, making it he can be a one-man army with all the weapons possibly available to him. That's not the case in Japan. And this Terminator, who is sent back, and his mission is very interesting, having to go around and find completely different methods to still cause all kinds of horrible gore and violence. This being an mature-rated anime show, it does not shy away from that whatsoever. And shout out to the sound engineers and Foley artists for this, because a lot of the body injuries and brutality are disgusting, particularly their sound effects. It was disgusting to listen to. Malcolm Lee's way of trying to counteract or fight back against Skynet being one of the most interesting parts of the show. We don't really get to know a lot about Skynet in general. It's always this unheard of entity that is surrounding what could actually be happening and might actually be a consequence of Terminators going back. As previously established, at least the way I absorbed their time travel, it was this loop where you're not necessarily sure if Skynet was created because the Terminators came back, or was Skynet always going to become an artificial intelligence, create the Terminators, launch the nukes, and wipe out humanity. Malcolm Lee, being from the future, a result of the Terminators taking over and Skynet launching those nukes, believes you can create an artificial intelligence without any motive or perspective and have it have a free will sentiment would result in it believing humanity needs to be saved. He's developed this AI with a character we learn later on, which is Misaki. Everyone has a Japanese name, which I really appreciate, and the fact that all of the characters are representative of different cultures. Of course, we're going to see a lot of Japanese characters, but I was expecting Malcolm Lee potentially to be somebody we knew already with a different name, because we learn about his identity not being who we thought he was near the end of the show or the season. It's probably the show. I'd be shocked if this runs for more than one season, just because of the story it does tell. But no, he is somebody of the future. But we do meet his mom, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So he creates Misaki in the future, a artificial intelligence in essentially a Terminator frame with the exterior of a Japanese woman. They go back so that way he can create, I want to get the names right on this because there's a lot of different ones. Kokoro as an, I almost said combatant, but another artificial intelligence creation that he believes, if trained well from himself personally, as well as all of the other data he's able to collect and present to Kokoro, that Kokoro would deem Skynet wrong and humanity worth saving. And the conversations of morality are what makes this show so curious and well thought out, in that each episode's about 30 minutes long, so you've got essentially 4 hours to tell this story, discussing the moralities of humanity, the divisiveness of culture, war. It mentions the fact that they are a result of men, which is just a fact, unfortunately, and how all these relationships and differences have always led to conflict. And the exploration of that when talking to someone who is completely objective to the scenarios is really not, I wouldn't even say it's entertaining, but thought-provoking. It brings out what works so well in science fiction. These ideas of essentially a thesis statement. I believe this, and with a fictional story, we're going to explore the reasoning behind that. And of course, this show was written by people. It wasn't generative AI. It presents a really interesting story. Malcolm Lee even faced with his humanity where he almost makes horrible decisions for the greater good. That typically being the defense of a hero who does bad things. Well, I did these bad things because of all the people, doing the percentages or the likelihood, like, is 2 people worth 2 billion? It's something that Star Trek has addressed, or recently with Captain America trying to save every life, and that 2 people aren't worth the cost of a larger number because of those 2 people. The conversations, particularly between Andre Holland and Rosario Dawson, Andre Holland being Malcolm Lee and Rosario Dawson being Kokoro, are at the core of the whole show leading up to Judgment Day, which is only one episode where the race against time is already present. We're not building to Judgment Day. It happens very quickly. And you see the nukes launch, what happens in America, but this is probably the first time. I'm not an expert on Terminator. I'd be the first person to tell you that, the franchise as a whole. But getting to see a different part of the world and what's happening with Skynet. On top of that, you see a Terminator doing the traditional Terminator thing, tracking a particular person. But his motive is one that's really interesting, and we explore multiple aspects of, could a Terminator lie, or are they just following the mission from their protocol as they've been told to do, which is that he's sent back to kill Malcolm Lee, but also to protect Malcolm's oldest son, Kenta, who is responsible, or at least it's established from him, voiced by Timothy Olyphant, the Terminator, that Kenta is responsible for a peace treaty between Skynet and the humans, and he presents it, and Kenta is given an option near the end of the show on whether to believe him or not, or to put his faith in Kokoro, the artificial intelligence developed by his father. So an unknown versus the thing I know my dad's created and his sentiment towards machines. Malcolm has this fear of them given the fact that he's aware of Judgment Day and how it has really affected particularly Kenta's view of technology being a tool, while his 2 younger kids don't really see it that way, particularly with Rika, who is given a cat earlier on, and anything to do with technology, Malcolm wants nothing to do with. The irony, of course, being that their babysitter / maid is an artificial intelligence, but that's obviously a great reveal near the end of the show. Or not even the end. I think it's probably about halfway. I kind of shotgunned through all of this, and I really enjoyed this experience where this is not cheap sci-fi. Of course, Judgment Day will, I feel like, always be the center of the Terminator franchise, but the role to which we get all of these classic Terminator elements, but exploring them in a new setting, it being a nostalgic element of still putting it in the 90s because Judgment Day has not moved, at least in this version, and exploring the time travel elements, how they affect what's going to happen in the future, but also, and I loved this about this show, certain things, as I said, are still fixed or potentially a result of their own, the future or the present, depending on your perspective, is a result of something having been done through time travel. That was really interesting to me, particularly with, I got to look up her name because I can't remember, with Aiko, who is sent back as a resistance fighter. And she is the Michael Biehn in this, or the Kyle Reese. She's sent back in time to shut off Kokoro, believing that Kokoro does not help fight against Skynet, that it actually might be an additional part of the problem. And it was not something I predicted whatsoever. I didn't see a lot of, or I saw a lot of what the show was laying out for foreshadowing, but Aiko being Malcolm's mother was a surprise I was not expecting, particularly when we start to see a lot of Malcolm's backstory get filled out. We don't see his mom, which I didn't necessarily think they were hiding from us, but all that reveal is particularly interesting because of those relationships and the way that we see them. It is not at first with Malcolm as a child, seeing his relationship where he is the older adult with his mother, the damage to her hand she does experience in this show, and we see him growing up. She had a robotic hand, likely adding to Malcolm's perspective on humanity and machines being able to work together to potentially solve this problem, is really interesting. Malcolm being somebody who believes that technology could be a solution is especially interesting given the time that he grows up in. We see a lot of people, particularly with the present being 1997 of the show, and their reaction to technology with AI taking over and Skynet is trying to wipe out humanity. Kokoro initially not seeing the benefit of humanity, but just with Malcolm's relationships with his family, seeing the good in humanity, ultimately deciding that she, or it, no, she picks a gender. Kokoro believes that humanity is worth saving. But that question of what are the pros and cons of humanity existing have always been a part of that idea with artificial intelligence. They see no need for humanity, or they don't believe that humanity being the dominant life force on Earth is to any benefit to the planet. We see in the Matrix that they wind up being a power source. In the Terminator franchise, Skynet believes they're irrelevant, or if not even irrelevant, they're bad for the planet, thus wiping them out and seeing no need for them whatsoever. This presents all the elements you would like from a Terminator franchise, television show, film, whatever. You get the movie monster element where you have a character, a Terminator, tracking people down. But what I appreciate so much about this is it is presented in the beginning to be so simple with, he's just going back to kill the guy. But we see as the events of the show unfold, this Terminator's missions change to some degree, or we're just slowly getting to see there are more details, finite details, in what he's supposed to be doing. He modifies one of Kokoro's robots that is current. There's essentially they appear to be, at least, the helper robots that you would see somewhat in something like iRobot, at least in Japan. Their aesthetic is very Japanese in design, which I really appreciated, where he solders one of their heads to his shoulder in a way of presenting being a friend to those robots who initially do act out in violence. And getting to see Kokoro's development was particularly interesting, as I said, because we don't get a lot of inside Skynet's brain or programming. Things just have happened. We are told what Skynet believes, but we don't really get to sit inside and see the reasonings behind all of that. It's usually just told through other characters. And having one of our leads of this show be the creator of artificial intelligence, seeing the benefits of it, and then having a conversation about morality with a computer could be incredibly boring, but it's the depth of these conversations that make it so interesting, and why I'm really glad we got something from Terminator that wasn't just another chase. It has that, but it's got a lot better questions that you would expect from a higher tier quality science fiction. And that's not to discredit what we got from the original Terminator film, which introduced us to this world and had some interesting questions already presented in that. And whether this would have to be a reference on purpose, which is that Kyle Reese going back in the original, this is a spoiler for a 40-year-old movie at this point, where Kyle Reese had to go back because he is John Connor's father. We don't get anything as specific as that, as we don't meet Malcolm's father. We have him meet his mom, but Aiko doesn't meet who eventually becomes the father because of when he's born. That would be 25 years later. One of the elements that I was curious about is how things are going to change, because we do know that Aiko gets her hand injured. She appears to be relatively the same, at least in character model design, when we see her in Malcolm's past, which was the future. So I'm curious, if we do get a season 2 from this, how these things are going to evolve. Are we going to see a glimpse into this new future? As I said, the way that this show breaks down how the time travel does work in this universe, I believe is the first time it's been presented in this zigzag fashion. But regardless of that, I really appreciate finding an avenue to address all of the continuity, making it relevant to the show. There has been no word on if they are going to make more. This, even though I loved it, it would be really interesting as opposed to just doing more of this, which if season 2 of this came out on Friday, I absolutely would watch that. I'm more interested in seeing an anthology series that tells different stories that have something to do with the Terminator world as a whole. This introduces all new characters. The Terminator doesn't look like Arnold. He doesn't look like anybody really we've seen. We do get a glimpse into Skynet's Terminator selection pods, and there's a wide variety of Terminators, which again addresses the fact that we've seen different people play them. We've seen Caucasian actors be Terminators, Austrian actors playing Terminators, and then we had an Asian actor play a Terminator in Terminator Genisys. Outside of Terminator Dark Fate, I didn't like Terminator Genisys. I'm still mad at James Cameron for telling me if I'm a fan of Terminator, I'm going to love it. Terminator Rise of the Machines is all right. I've never watched Sarah Jane, that's Doctor Who, the Sarah Connor Chronicles. I'd be curious if there are any elements from this that are particularly interesting or have been revisited or not. But overall, if you're a fan of the Terminator franchise, this is a revisit that is absolutely worth your time. The 4 hours was really interesting. It provides all the elements you would like from a Transformer. Sorry, I saw Transformers 1 early, and that was a slip. That'll be next week's episode. But you have, as I was saying, you have all of the classic elements you appreciate from the Terminator franchise, but because of the gift of time, it's able to explore all of that subtext with a much more intricate brush than just having to do general broad strokes, which I really appreciated. The action was really interesting, particularly because, as I said, the firearm usage is minimal. We have to see a lot more of ingenuity, even from Ico trying to fight off the Terminator. There's a lot more use of booby traps and whatnot, which I found to be really interesting. The use of the theme song is great, much more muddled in its extravagance than we've heard from before. And the relationships from man and machine, the dichotomy to those relationships, particularly with one's experience and the way it's presented in all these different ways, was quite captivating, particularly Aiko's relationship with Misaki. She's grown up in a world completely terrified of machines and having to ally herself with one. And the inner struggle she has with that decision ultimately comes from the fact that she knows that this machine will help her. And I'd be curious to see how that relationship develops moving forward, but I'm not sure if it's going to. We know that this show is great. I shouldn't say we. I know that this show is great. I think Mattson Tomlin did a phenomenal job with this new perspective into the Terminator universe. Let me know if you've seen it. You can comment on social media when the episode goes live. That's all I have to say about Terminator Zero, or as it was originally known, Terminator the Anime Series.
Can I ask you a question? Just fun?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
Last week's question of the week was, what was your favorite Tim Burton film? Keen Machine wrote in, my favorite Tim Burton film is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory with Johnny Depp as Willy Wonka. I know I'll take the heat for that opinion, but I've always loved the version of the classic story and can probably quote most of it, if not all the movie. As we did the musical when I was in high school, I had the pleasure of playing Willy Wonka in the production, and I heavily leaned into Johnny Depp's performance to influence my own. Some people loved it, some people hated it, but I regret nothing. I'm not going to say anything because I value your friendship, Keen, so to each, to their own. Stephanie writes in, I am extremely disappointed that Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas is not considered a Tim Burton film. I ain't touching that. Stephanie, you text me and we talked about it. So I'll have to go with what would have been my very close second, Sleepy Hollow. Okay, the costuming and the sets are as beautiful as the story is creepy. Interesting. So far, we haven't had anything be the same, but I think that's probably going to come to an end now. Scotty Cameron, my favorite Tim Burton film is Batman 1989. While I'm not a huge fan of Burton making Batman a murderer or Joker killing Batman's parents, this are obviously big changes from the comics. The acting, the score, and set design make up for a character writing and storytelling decisions I wasn't a fan of. In general, I've been indifferent about Burton as a filmmaker, like some of his movies, i.e. Batman, and disliked others, i.e. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Okay, Jermaine Jones commented on Twitter, quit playing with a gif of Batman from Batman 89. Crazy Maniac wrote in Sweeney Todd, and Dylan Pollock of Movies to Watch Before You Die wrote in definitely Batman 89 or Batman Returns. That's probably my favorite Gotham City in any movie version of Batman. That's really interesting. I hadn't really considered that. I mean, they're all so different. You could argue that the Batman Gotham and his Gotham are probably the closest. I understand a lot of love for Batman 89. It's interesting because that's probably the one I've seen the most of his. But my favorite Tim Burton film is Big Fish. I absolutely love it. It's not a film I think a lot of people talk about, but particularly the performance by Ewan McGregor is fantastic. And I thought it was weird, but it was also really heartwarming all at the same time. So yeah, I would have to say it's Big Fish. So that's last week's question of the week. This week's question of the week is Terminator based. So my question is, coming from Terminator Zero, if you could set a Terminator series in any time and any location, where would that be set? I'm really curious. After having a Terminator series set in Japan, I'd be really curious to see it. My answer is probably a Western. How would you deal with a Terminator with what you have available in that time period? It's one of the elements that made Prey so interesting, setting it in indigenous America. That was amazing. If you would like to write in and answer the question of the week, you can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com. You can comment on the social media post, usually goes up Thursday or Friday. If you haven't yet, please follow the podcast on your podcast platform or leave a review. I believe you can only do that on iTunes at this point, and you can only do 5-star or stars on Spotify. Next week's episode of the podcast will be a review of Transformer 1, the second, not live action, that's been the norm for so long. It's only the second animated Transformer film in the whole history of the franchise. I have seen it already, and I look forward to reviewing it next week. My name is Kyle Naranya. Please share the podcast with your film-loving friends, and I can't wait to see you next time.